The early period of the 32-bit gaming generation was an interesting time for video games, as we would see a transition beyond anything that we were never ready to even see or witness at the time. Essentially, we weren't ready for what we were about to see. Coming off the back of playing games on early pixelated variations with consoles from the likes of the Sega Mega Drive Master System, while there was early attempts at 3D on those consoles, and they did a good job considering the limitations on the hardware, but it would be in the early 90s where that would start to come into fruition, and you would start to see, especially in the early years of the 90s, you would see a lot of arcade games move into the 3D realm, with many arcade classics that defined many different types of genres and would become cult classics in their own right. Many of these games, it was inevitable that they would definitely see a later port or variation added to consoles. So with the likes of the PlayStation and even with the Sega Saturn of the time, would see a lot of those games be added to their lineup, and Cyber Sled from Namco would be one of those titles. While it didn't appear on the Sega Saturn, but it did appear on the PlayStation, being a port of the arcade original, releasing in 1995, 2 years after the arcade release in 1993. And the arcade release was known to be quite popular for its time, playing as a 3D arena based shooter where you played as a load of different mechs or machines in battles, where you fight one on one against different opponents, and the goal is literally just to keep eliminating opponents until you can reach the top and become the overall master of the tournament itself that you were involved in. So when the game got a release on the PlayStation in 1995, and considering this would be one of the earliest games to ever be released on the console, it came at a time when the PlayStation had massive hype around it. So you would also see a lot of early Namco arcade titles get ports to the console. You had Ridge Racer, you had Tekken, you had Air Combat, among many others, and Cyber Sled would also get that transition. And while it didn't gain the popularity as those other titles did, it still had its own place, as it presented something different and unique, but it also added different elements to the original arcade entry that gave you access to different modes, where you could play with the original arcade graphics that were polygon based, that were not textured, so you could play it in its original format. But then you also had access to a realistic texture based mapped mode that would allow you to view the game from different perspective with more detail, as all of the environments and the vehicles themselves all had some form of textures or graphics to make the game more real in terms of the play style. So each of the machines and the characters in the game had their own dynamics, they had their own individual characteristics to make them stand out from everything else that was available in the game. Plus you had access to some more maps that wasn't available in the arcade original. So it represented an overall decent enough package, but in saying that, the game still received mixed reviews at the time. Some people loved it, some people were kind of on the fence about it, but no one really hated the game. If anything, everyone found it to be enjoyable and playable. Mind you, this came at a time with these type of games, because of the control systems, sometimes arcade controls didn't fully adapt to consoles all that well, and it left at times feeling the experience to be a bit sluggish or clunky. Now in saying that, this game isn't really like that. Once you get familiar and understand the control systems, it does become quite an enjoyable experience, although rather short, but it can be tricky for the absolute newbie to come in and play it, which can definitely throw beginner players off, more to the point, but more seasoned players will definitely get something out of it. But it's one of those games which is funny, it may not appeal to you on your first attempt, but if you come back to it after a period of time, it's one of those games that suddenly just clicks for you, where everything makes sense, you can understand the controls better, and it is a decent title for what it does do. Considering it to be an early title, it's better than you would expect, although it's not going to be as good if you consider other games I mentioned earlier on with Ridge Race or Tekken, Air Combat and among a few others. Now they're completely different games. This is a totally different game in that respect, and again it does try to do something very very different, but it has some really cool features. Like, the game essentially is played from a third person point of view, but does allow you to go into a first person mode to interact with the environments and the gameplay and even the combat aesthetics. But it also has a decent 2-player multiplayer mode as well, so that you can play it against one-on-one against your mates, which also adds adds to the appeal, and in many ways can also add to the competitive nature of the experience as well, which can also make it even better. So your goal essentially is to become the winner or the master of the tournament that you're in. So you will compete against different opponents. They all have their own characteristics and attributes. So once you pick one character, you stay with them until you've either completed the campaign or you've been eliminated. But you will know that the difficulty does increase with each battle that you find yourself in, especially with the final battle with the last boss, as he is definitely a lot more powerful than you with better weapons, more armor on his vehicle. So you will have to really alter your strategy, and it's the same with every opponent that you face in the game. You will have to somewhat change your strategy to suit and to give you an advantage in each scenario. Sometimes it will work, sometimes it won't, but just know that if you do die at any point in this game, it is game over. So there's a number of different opponents that you will have to face, anywhere between 8 and 10 battles, which is quite short depending on how well you do in each battle. But as soon as you die, it's game over, regardless of who you're facing or who you're fighting in that respect, and you will have to start the entirety of the experience all over again, which will definitely frustrate the hell out of some players, and that's the way it would have been back then. Now luckily enough, with emulation today, if you want to use a save state, you can just pick up where you left off and just keep trying until you finish it, and chances are you probably will. But it is one of those games that does require a lot of patience and skill in order to master, and it would have done more so back then. While it's not the best of these early games, it was definitely different. Even when I look back on my own experience of the game, while I didn't play it in the first few months of the first time I played the console way back in late 1996, when I did eventually get to play it, I thought it was pretty cool, but I will admit I found the controls to be a little bit on the clunky side and I didn't really know what to do. But it's funny, coming back to playing it all those years later, even when I come back to pick it up to play it again for this video, I was able to play it no problem. I was able to familiarise myself with the controls a lot quicker than I normally would, and I have to say I thoroughly enjoyed the experience all over again. I actually had a blast with it. So it is a fun title. It just depends on the player. It depends on your own perception of it, of what you think or what you want to get out of it really. It's definitely reflective of its time. It really is. But that's its unique charm. That's its calling card. That's what makes it really stand out. It's from a period when everything was new. Not so much innovative, but it was different. It stood out because of its time and because of what it was trying to do. While it may not have aged well, it still holds its place in gaming history. It is a very unique experience. And yes, it is an interesting game that came out at an interesting time for video games in general. And I think that the early months of the PlayStation's life cycle were definitely among some of the best ever in gaming history, as you had so many different types of titles, so many experimental titles. You even had great ports of classic arcade games, but that were also experimental in their own right, and they just helped the console to evolve. And yes, while Sled was never considered the best of this roundup of arcade ports, it still held its own in many regards. It still sold decently enough, it still had a unique fan base, people still enjoyed it, but it also helped to push the console to new heights, because when we think of the theme around the PlayStation at the time, the PlayStation was themed around the future of gaming. It was the future, and a lot of these games that were coming out were very futuristic in how they presented themselves, and Sled was no different to many other games out there. So it definitely fitted in very well with that trend or that persona that was going on around that time. A lot of these games really did help to sell the PlayStation and to make it the powerhouse that it was yet to become. So in many respects, these early games are still worth playing today, and they are a valuable piece of history for the console, but just for gaming in general. Whether you played it in the arcade or whether you played it on the PlayStation, it is a short but fun experience if you're willing to put time into it. And Namco had a lot of these really quirky and obscure games back then, and they were very, very cool, I have to say. They will appeal to a lot of people. May not be to everybody, but they definitely will appeal to a lot, and I do think that they are worth revisiting. This definitely is. Even going back to playing it, even though it's in short bursts, it's still a lot of fun to play. I do highly recommend that you give it a try. Regardless of what people say about it, regardless of the reviews, it is a good solid short title, worth playing in short bursts in many ways. And if you do enjoy these earlier titles, I would love to know your thoughts of games like this that were released during the early months of the PlayStation, and what did you think of them overall? Did you really enjoy the unique aesthetic these games were going for back then, or maybe not so much? So be sure to share it down in the comments below. And if you would like to see more content around many more of these distinctive arcade ports and early titles that were released on the PlayStation, then you can check out the playlist and the videos here on screen to see more of those games in action. And as always, keep those gaming memories alive.